Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Rian Keating. Today we're delighted to have the opportunity to interview one of New York's more versatile performers, an actor who's appeared on Broadway in such shows as Rags, Cats, A Chorus Line, and A Day in Hollywood and A Night in the Ukraine, and off-Broadway in such shows as Harry Chapin's Lies and Legends. He's also a member of the AIDS activist organization ACT UP. It's a pleasure to welcome Mark Fotopoulos. Mark,
Hello.
welcome.
Thank you.
So nice to meet you. I've admired your work for
Thanks.
a long time.
It's nice to hear.
Now, you got started at the age of 8, if I'm not mistaken, when you were pulled out of school.
That's when I was inspired. My mom took me to see the National Touring Company of Oliver, and I was 8 years old, and there were all those 8-year-old kids running all over the stage at the Schubert in Chicago, and I got the cast album for Christmas, and I drove everybody nuts singing all of the songs. I mean, Food, Glorious Food, 16 verses, and that sort of did it to me, and I started doing children's theater. My mother made my costumes, and junior high school, college, I just was totally immersed in theater. It was my life. And I moved to New York right after I graduated from college, and within 2 months I was in the Broadway company of Chorus Line, which was a dream come true for me there.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit. Was your mother a stage mother?
I think my mother always wanted to be an actress. She told me a story once she went to an audition in school with a girlfriend of hers. The girlfriend was going to audition for the school play, and the director saw my mother and asked her to read and gave her the lead, and she came home and told her father, and he went, no, he's this old Greek man. He said, no, he will not be in the theater. But she used to do talent shows at the women's club and danced and sang. I think she was a stage mother. I think I blocked it out, but now that I've been in therapy for about 7 years, it's coming out. Yeah, but she was great. She always supported me, and I still get a kick out of her seeing me perform.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Uh-huh.
How did your father react to all this?
Well, my parents were divorced when I was very young, at about the age of 8. Oh. So he always lived in the town where we lived, and he would come to see me and things, but we weren't as close as my mother and I were. But he comes to New York and sees me perform and gets a kick out of it, and always talks about his son, the actor, and boasts nonstop. It's a bit of a trial when I get home and the neighbors come over or whatever, but he's a proud father.
So you moved to New York and made your debut in A Chorus Line.
Right. I did it for about 9 months, and then I busted my knee up. I was playing the role of Paul. This is a story it's a very famous Chorus Line story. I was playing the role of the guy who busts his knee at the end of the show, and I did it in the opening number during the jazz combination, center stage, and I was out flat, and they had to stop the orchestra, and I got up and kind of hobbled off stage, and that was the last performance I ever did of Chorus Line.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, it was a shame. The shame was I had just been cast in the National Touring Company of Fosse's Dancing, which was just going to go out, and I can remember I was saying to my doctor, I can do it, and he was going, no, you're going to be out of commission for a long time, and I can remember taking a cab to Capizio's to have a costume fitting, and I'd left my crutches in the cab and hobbled up that long flight of stairs and went in there and had my costume fitting and hobbled back out, and then I finally realized, So I never got to work with Fosse. It was one of my big regrets.
But you've worked with Jerome Robbins and Tommy Tune.
That was another regret, Jerome Robbins. No, he was kind of a scary.
Well, that's what I hear. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, you always hear that famous story of how he backed up and fell into the orchestra pit. And
no, I haven't heard that.
Oh, you've never heard that?
I've never heard of it.
Very famous story. He was on stage with, I don't know what company. It must have been one of his ballet companies. And he kept backing up and fell into the orchestra pit. And nobody said, watch out, Mr. Robbins, you're going to fall. And when you worked with him, you realized why nobody said, watch out, Mr. Robbins. He's very, very intense, and he's a bit scary, but he's a genius, and you just have to put up with that. I don't envy anybody going into rehearsal for 18 weeks with him on this new project he's doing. There are 18 weeks of rehearsal to restage all of his Broadway dances. But it was an experience, West Side Story. Definitely not my favorite experience, but an experience.
Well, one of your experiences was Rags of a couple seasons back, which
Oh, yes.
not too many people remember.
No.
It seemed to have everything from the Statue of Liberty to Marsha Lewis.
Yes, Marsha was great, and there was that Statue of Liberty was pretty great. Yes, it was a shame that the show did close, like so many flops after 4 performances, but it was not a well-produced show. It had great elements. I thought it had a beautiful score, and Teresa Stratas was an incredibly exciting performer. But they really made a lot of wrong choices at the beginning. After spending hundreds of $1,000s on a workshop, they went into production months and months later with a totally different creative staff. The wrong director, the wrong designer, the wrong choreographer, and had to replace them all and spend zillions of dollars doing that and on delays and postponements. And by the time the show opened and needed $1 million to keep it alive, there was just no money left, and it went down the drain.
How far into rehearsals did you realize it wasn't going to be a success?
I'm afraid it was the first day of rehearsal when we got into rehearsal with this woman, Joan Micklin Silver, who had been chosen to direct this musical and really had no experience and didn't know anything about the process of creating a musical. Although I think she had done My Name is Alice.
That's right.
Which I never saw, and she had directed this brilliant film, Hester Street.
Well, that's a horse of a different color.
Yes, but I guess the producers saw this movie and thought this is all about the immigrant experience in New York, and Rags is all about the immigrant experience in New York, and this woman made a wonderful movie, so she can make a wonderful Broadway show, but she just had no idea, and they kept her around for about 5 weeks and then fired her, and then the composers took over as directors, and then we were without a director, out of town, and finally by the time we did get somebody who knew what he was doing, Gene Sachs, it was too late. There wasn't enough time, there wasn't enough money.
How was he to work with?
It was such a short period that I don't really remember much. He was a tough guy. He made some concrete choices and went with them, and he was a nice man, but he just didn't have enough time. If he had had the project from the beginning, but by the time he came onto it, it was beyond repair, really. A director has to start from the beginning and have his influence on every aspect of it, and he was saddled with this operatic set, and there was just no hope.
What about Teresa Stratas? Because anybody in the opera world will tell you she's
a mad woman. No. She's a Greek, and I'm Greek, so we have this kindred spirit. She was really a wonderful woman to work with. And I hear stories about her temper tantrums and throwing chairs at piano players. I never saw any of that. I don't know how much is true. But she's a very demanding performer, and she's used to being a diva and expecting to be treated like that and working in the environment that she wants and needs. And so it's a bit of a shock to people who are used to working without divas to all of a sudden have a diva in your midst. But she was very exciting to work with and very committed and gave 110% all the time. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it was one of the most exciting performances I'd seen on stage in a long time.
Now, as we mentioned at the top of the show, you're also a member of ACT UP, the activist organization.
Right, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power.
Now, you're also a PWA.
Right, I was diagnosed with AIDS in April of 1985. So it's been over 3 years.
Now, that was before the big Rock Hudson publicity, and
just before. I think a couple of months later, he came out about having AIDS. I was in the closet for about 2 years, really. It was supposedly one of the better kept secrets in New York, because I was terribly paranoid about going from job to job and having to audition for show after show. And at that time, 3 years ago, people with AIDS were not it wasn't as relaxed a situation. I don't even know now if it's more relaxed, but people are, I think, getting used to being around people with AIDS and working with them. But I was totally paranoid about it, so I really stayed in the closet for about 2 years.
But what was your first reaction? Because
to being diagnosed? My first reaction was, I'll never have a lover again. At the time I was single. I had had a long-term relationship that had been over for about 2 years. I think that was my first reaction. I didn't think I was going to die. I've never thought I was going to die. I was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma. I haven't had any other infectious diseases, opportunistic infections. So it was something that totally changed my life, and it took me a while to realize it. I went through a long period of denial, I think. I accepted the fact that something was going on, but I really didn't accept the whole thing of what was going on until about 2 years later when I came out about having AIDS and quit show business, so to speak. I was doing Cats at the time, and I'd done it for 6 months on Broadway, and my contract came up for renewal, and I thought, I just can't take a week's vacation and then be a cat for another 6 months. It wasn't important enough, and AIDS really is my life right now, and this epidemic is what's most important in my life, and trying to find a cure and fight off homophobia and get the government off its ass. And I really thought the best thing that I could be doing as a person was to raise people's consciousness and identify myself as a person with AIDS. So it was a year ago on Gay Pride Day, I made a sign that said, "Living with AIDS." At that time, it was 2 years, 2 months, and counting. No thanks to you, Mr. Reagan. And I carried it down Fifth Avenue in the march. It was very emotional because the crowd was so responsive, and it was really a wonderful experience. And then the next day, I joined ACT UP. I heard about them at the march. I went to their Monday night meeting at the community center. And the next day, Tuesday, I was being arrested on the steps of the federal courthouse down in Foley Square. And I was this militant, radical activist. And it's been a year of working with ACT UP and demonstrating and going to Washington a couple of times and to Albany and really fighting because the government is not doing enough and people are just sitting back and letting their friends die. And it's really a matter of life and death for me and for my friends. And I've seen too many people die, and I know the government isn't doing enough. And that's what we're trying to do, is put the pressure on the government and tell them what needs to be done and tell them we won't put up with this genocide with them letting us die off.
Well, when I first heard of ACT UP, it was very peripheral. And I really didn't read the information you gave me because I wanted to hear it from you before I subjected myself to that. But my initial reaction was it's terribly militant. And
we are.
They sound like a bunch of rowdy schoolboys.
And girls. We have some rowdy schoolgirls too. Well, the clinical definition for ACT UP is it's a nonpartisan, diverse group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. Basically, one of the specific goals is to get more drugs released for PWAs, and that's been a big focus. We did a 3-day round-the-clock picket line in front of Sloan Kettering last July in this heat. Oh, it was this hot last year, too, and we were out there for 3 days picketing because at that time Sloan Kettering was an AIDS treatment evaluation unit set up by the government that had spent billions of dollars to do drug trials on people with AIDS, and they were only testing AZT, and they only had a fraction of the number of PWAs in there that they could be. So that's been a big focus to try and get more drugs released. AZT has cornered the market, and Burroughs Wellcome must have some pact with the FDA to only have their drug approved. It's the only approved drug, and it's criminal, really. And the profiteering, they make $10,000 off of every patient who's on AZT for a year. It's obscene, really. And of course, we're fighting for civil rights for PWAs and the end to discrimination and legislation to prevent discrimination. And we followed the President's Commission on AIDS all around the country and kept on their heels and got people to resign. We got them to put legislation into order and make recommendations to the President that we were demanding. We had quite a profound impact on that, and it really goes to show what you can do. I think AIDS activist organizations are the most important groups around because you can do benefits, you can give $100 here and there to the gay men's health crisis or whatever, but the money is really in the government, and they're the only ones that have enough money to get things in the works and to find a cure and to get people, to get doctors in workplaces to work on this. And without the government's help, we're never going to end the crisis. So it's up to us to get the government to act compassionately and effectively and act now.
But do you feel, and I know this is a terribly pointed question, and I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth, but by going and sitting in the gutter, getting arrested, do you feel that people are going to look at that as positive publicity?
I don't think there's any such thing as positive or negative publicity. It's just publicity. And the reason we stage civil disobedience is to get publicity and to embarrass the government. And usually when there is civil disobedience and people are arrested, the article in the Times will be printed and it'll say 32 people were arrested or 111 were arrested. I've only been arrested once. I do think it's sort of ineffectual unless it's more militant. But I've carry my sign around. I've been carrying it for a year, and each time, every month, I change the number on it, so it's gone from 2 years and 2 months to 3 years and 3 months. And I get a lot of publicity with that. That sign's been photographed as much as Brooke Shields, and it's gotten into a lot of national newspapers and magazines, and I do a lot of interviews. Reporters will come up to me on the street while we're doing a picket and interview me, and I think I get my message across by doing that. So I've opted not to do civil disobedience anymore, really, unless it's something specifically that I think demands it. But a lot of people get pissed off by civil disobedience and blocking traffic and making things inconvenient for other people, but I don't think blacks in the 60s civil rights movement made many friends by burning down cities and stuff, but they got what they wanted, and we need to get what we want. You know, silence equals death. That's our motto, and unless we get out there and keep screaming, people are just going to keep dying, and I'd rather be creating a nuisance and trying to save lives, my own included.
Now, you've been living for 3 months and 3 years, which that's a very good statistic.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
And it's getting better. And how do you attribute that? Do you think your anger has propelled you?
I think my activism work, I look on it as a part of my healing process, because I think it's very therapeutic to be active and to be fighting for your life instead of just sitting back and, say, letting a doctor prescribe drugs. Or I think taking an active part in your healing is essential. I think my attitude has been positive from the outset, and I think that's crucial. I think it would be very easy to die after a diagnosis of AIDS if you just sit back and go, oh, I'm going to die.
And many people do.
Yes, and that's the tragedy, that people do, and I've seen it happen, and I really think that more than the experimental drugs I've been on, I think my attitude has carried me through. Also, I'm in that small percentage of people who just have an early diagnosis of KS and no other opportunistic infections, and that puts me in that 15% that have been living 5 years or more. It's not 100% fatalistic disease, and that's the story that the media puts out because it makes good copy. But for PWAs, I try and get the message out that you can survive, and this is becoming a treatable disease like cancer instead of a totally fatal disease.
Now, you were diagnosed while you were working on Broadway.
Right, I was doing a play called The Loves of Anatole at Circle in the Square, and it was very odd circumstances because I had been hired at the last minute to understudy, and one of the guys I was understudying was diagnosed with AIDS 2 days before the play opened, and I went into his role, and he went into the hospital, and he had pneumonia. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks and then came back into the show and resumed his role. A year later, he died, but it was very weird because at the end of the run, the last week of the run, I was diagnosed. So it was like the Twilight Zone or something.
But after that, you went into Harry Chapin's show at the Village Gate.
Yeah, one of my favorite shows I'd ever done.
I just remember being so moved, and I'm a pretty hard nut to crack.
Really?
And how much of your situation were you able to put into what you were doing? Because those songs are so rich with meaning.
I tell you that his songs were incredibly affecting, and when that show closed, I felt a loss like I'd never felt after dropping out of any other show or any other show closing. I'm not quite sure. My diagnosis was so new. I literally went into the show, I think, a week or two after I was diagnosed. And Harry Chapin is terribly heterosexual, and there wasn't much that connected, but it was such an emotional show, and I was working with my good friend Terry Klausner, and it was just 5 people and the band, and it was a beautiful experience, and everybody just had such a wonderful time working on that material. It was one of my top 2 experiences in the theater, I'd say.
What's the other one?
Hollywood Ukraine, doing Groucho. That was one of my favorites. And it was one of my favorite shows I'd ever seen. I saw it long before I went into it, but Groucho was great. I think of him as an old friend, and I'd love to do it again. Mm-hmm. That was great.
So you say you've given up performing, but you're also active in the People with AIDS Theater Workshop.
Right. I joined the PWA Theater Workshop November last year. They had developed a piece in a workshop process, a bunch of PWAs sitting around a tape recorder telling their experiences, and developed it into a theater piece. And I went into the show, and we performed for student groups, colleges. We did a high school up in the Bronx. We did AIDS support groups, a couple of hospitals. And it's a wonderful way of putting a human face on the epidemic, and for people who really haven't experienced anything except reading newspaper articles or seeing stories on the news. It was a wonderful way of raising their consciousness and getting them to see the human side of it. And I think as an actor it was a great experience also, but I looked at it more as an extension of my activism, a less militant way of getting in front of people and saying, I'm a person with AIDS, and these are my stories, and had some political overtones, some comments on the Reagan administration and their lack of action.
Now you might be going to Atlanta next month for the next week.
Actually,
for the convention.
Right. Saturday, ACT UP is sending a contingent down to Atlanta for the Democratic Convention to try and press the AIDS issues and get them onto the platform. They'll be doing the same for the Republican Convention in August down in New Orleans. I just think it's terribly important to do that in this election year, to get the candidates to face the issues, and AIDS is an issue they were totally trying to ignore as much as they can unless people really press the issues. Mm-hmm. So that's what we'll be doing, and whoever we're stuck with in the White House, we just have to pray that they do more than Mr. Reagan did, because he made a career in 8 years out of ignoring the situation, which has been so tragic.
Now, for those who want to get involved with ACT UP, they meet once a week.
We meet Monday nights at 7:30 at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center, which is at 208 West 13th Street, right off of 7th Avenue. And anybody can come. It's a very diverse group. We have gays, lesbians, straights. It's a wonderful group of people who really care, and there's lots of committees you can get onto and to develop actions or just become involved, get to know the issues, come to the demonstrations, and act up and help save lives.
Mark, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Rian Keating, and you've been watching Spotlight. Our guest today has been Mark Fotopoulos. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can write to myself in care of Pirot Productions, 640 10th Avenue, New York, New York, 10036. Spotlight airs Tuesday evenings at 8:30 on Channel D and 11:30 Saturday mornings on Channel C. Till next week, I'm Rian Keating. Have a good week. Oh, thanks so much.